Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. Welcome all to this webinar that IISD is hosting jointly with the Singapore Management University Center for Commercial Law in Asia on implementing the European Deforestation Regulation perspectives from Southeast Asia. I am Cristina Larrea, the Director of Agriculture, Food and Sustainability Initiatives at IISD, and it is my pleasure to welcome you to this session and be one of your co-moderators today. As we know, the conservation of forests has, especially related to commodity production, has become a major concern, a global concern for all of us, gaining political and public attention. For example, at COP26 in Glasgow, over 140 countries committed to halt and reverse deforestation by 2030. This means that the policy action is expected to address deforestation and ensure forest conservation across different geographies. Governments across the world have designed and are implementing different strategies, policy measures to reverse deforestation and protect forests, including related to trade. I'll give you an example, like IISD, we examined couple of years ago, a number of free trade agreements that incorporate forest conservation measures. Also, more recently, sustainability due diligence regulations linked to market access of products have been established to protect forests and ensure commodity-free deforestation. Governments for many years now have been also promoting the use of voluntary sustainability schemes as a way to complement regulation and advance forest conservation initiatives. Deforestation is a global challenge, and no single country can tackle it alone. Collaboration is essential to ensure effective and fair implementation of these measures. Equally important is to understand the supporting measures and needs that businesses and producers on the ground have in order to be successful in protecting forests while ensuring their livelihoods. Today, IISD, we have been working on the issue of deforestation for many years now, since 2021. But today, our webinar is focused on Southeast Asia. As you know, the European the European Deforestation Regulation came into force in June 2023, and is expected its full implementation at the end of this year, which means December 2025. Southeast Asia is a region where there are producers and businesses that grow palm oil, rubber, coffee, and wood, which are some of the commodities that have been targeted by the EU deforestation regulation. So that makes this webinar very important in order to understand what are the perspectives from actors and our colleagues in Southeast Asia, how they are preparing to comply with this EU deforestation regulation, what are the supporting measures that they need. Next slide, please. So today, we will unpack, following these welcoming remarks, we will unpack for you the main components of the European Deforestation Regulation. After, we will have a panel discussion with our guest speakers to understand how producers and businesses are preparing for complying with this regulation, as well as some experts on the topic in order to have an insightful conversation. You will be invited to formulate your question in the Q&A in order to have an insightful dialogue after with our guest speakers. Today, before passing the word to my colleague, I would like to mention that we offer interpretation in Indonesia Bahasa. So you are very welcome to choose your languages at the bottom of the screen. You can choose the language at which you want to hear the presentation, either in Indonesian Bahasa or in English. Before passing the word to my colleague, Stefanie Schacherer, who's going to unpack for us the EU deforestation regulation, I would like to start with a poll to hear from you who is in the room. So the audience is very mixed. We have private sector, we have SMEs, we have a government regulatory body, non-governmental organizations, very split, to be honest. And then we have just a few certification standards. We have also smallholders. Okay, very good. And the next question is how familiar we are. So I think the majority, about 50%, is somewhat familiar with the EU deforestation regulation, so they have basic understanding, but need more details. Okay, this is perfect. And there is 20%, over 23% are very familiar with the measure. And just 9%, which is not familiar, is very new to them. So this is fantastic. There is a mix of knowledge in the room. So we look forward to engaging with you. So thank you for responding to these two first questions. So I would like to, next slide, please. I would like to pass the word to Stefanie Schacherer, who is Assistant Professor of Law at the Singapore Management University Center for Commercial Law in Asia, in South Asia, who is going to unpack for us the European deforestation regulation and have a pleasant dialogue with all the guest speakers later on. Please, Stefanie, the word is yours.
Thank you very much, Cristina. Thank you very much to IISD for this collaboration, which we at SMU are very happy about. As was introduced, I have the pleasure to provide a short overview, probably to bring up the audience all to the same, hopefully, level playing field, and to then lead the moderation with our excellent expert panelists later. So next slide, please. Next slide. Yes, so again, Singapore Management University, and we just launched a new research initiative, which is called Singapore Sustainable Future Initiative. And we look in particular on sustainability challenges in Southeast Asia, in the region where we are. But let me dive into the EUDR. So the objective of the EUDR is to address deforestation globally. It has also the second objective of mitigate climate change and to safeguard biodiversity. It is part of the European Union Green Deal, which is a major policy agenda for the transformation of the European economy towards more sustainable pathways. The EUDR is often called extraterritorial. It is a legislation that is regulating processes and production methods that are not taking place in the European Union, but in third countries. And some of the countries were mentioned already, Malaysia and Indonesia, of course, impacted by this. The EU often justifies this approach by the fact that the EU is one of the major consumers of the commodities covered in the regulation, which would give the responsibility to also address these issues. Now, the main scope is that the EUDR regulates the making available on and export from the European market of specific forest risk commodities or products in general that are connected to deforestation and forest degradation. So the commodities covered are 7: cattle, cacao, coffee, oil palm, rubber, soy, and wood. And we heard from Cristina already that oil palm as well as rubber are particularly important in the Southeast Asian context. Next slide, please. So what is the main obligation under the EUDR? That is really a prohibition in the sense that any operator or trader who imports to or exports from the EU market must prove that the listed commodities and the products that are produced from these commodities do not originate from recently deforested land or have contributed to forest degradation. So in other words, to say this more in more easy words, is that products are assumed to be non-compliant unless proven otherwise. So unless the operator or trader proves that the product is not originating from a recently deforested land or from a land where we see forest degradation. The non-compliant products are prohibited from entering the EU market. So again, if this is the prohibition, then the operator or trader must prove that the product that they trade is compliant. Okay, so the burden of proof is clearly on the producers, suppliers, traders, and all the other operators. Next slide, please. In order to show non-compliance, there is a due diligence requirements. And the due diligence requirements, of course, make many of us think of the other legislations that the EU is simultaneously adopted, such as the CSDDD. But due diligence here implies, first of all, a risk assessment, and if risk is detected, a risk mitigation. Now, what makes the EUDR in particular demanding is the requirement that the due diligence statement must have a certain amount of information. So there is an information obligation that the producer, again, the trader or operator, needs to add. And this is here on the slide. You see that the country of production needs, of course, be clearly stated. Data on geolocalization, I'm sure we will hear of this during our discussion later, with a precise geolocalization from where the product or commodity originates. And all this must be adequately conclusive and verifiable information. That, as I said, might imply clear pictures and maps of which piece of land we're talking about. In addition, producers and operators must show that the commodity has been produced in accordance with the relevant legislation of the country of production. So instead of saying precisely which pieces of legislation in each country they must comply, it is the relevant legislation of the country of production. So this can send the producer back to Indonesian law, to Malaysian law, and so on. This is the due diligence statement. Okay, next slide, please. Right. The next point that I would like to highlight is the so-called benchmarking. And this is a point of controversy. The EUDR establishes a three-tier benchmarking system in which they classify their member states, but most importantly, they classify third countries by the risk of producing non-compliant forest risk commodities. And there are three: low, standard risk, and high risk. Now, currently, we're still in the initial phase. All the countries are considered standard risk. But the Commission plans to publish a benchmarking list in June of this year. And there are some criteria, such as the deforestation rate in that particular country, the degree of agricultural land expansion for the FRCs concerned, and trends in relevant FRCs and products production. And so this is still pending, and some countries are, of course, closely looking at this. It is very relevant because if you are considered a high-risk country, the due diligence requirements are more stringent and the controls are more frequent. So it has concrete practical implications. Next slide, please. Okay, to finish some of the key dates, I have mentioned a few. We heard that the EUDR entered into force in June 2023. The cutoff date, the first date here on the slide, is also very important because this is from when on deforestation, forest degradation would count. So everything, every piece of land where deforestation or forest degradation occurred after this date would be non-compliant with the EUDR. Another important date I've just mentioned is then June of this year, where the planned country benchmarking will be published by the European Commission. And last but not least, the entry into force of the prohibition requirement start to apply on the 30th December of this year. And as many of you know, this is the postponed date, as initially it was planned to happen on the 30th of December 2024. Due to pressure from the trading partners, the EU announced in last autumn to postpone the start of the actual application and of the prohibitions to the end of this year. Okay, and there is a bit of a staggering for, just to clarify, 30th of June 2026. These prohibitions will then also apply to small and medium enterprises. Okay, next slide, please. Well, just a few figures. We could have many more on the slides, but the commodities are very important for Southeast Asia. The palm oil industry represents significant amounts of the GDPs of Indonesia and Malaysia. And importantly, Indonesia and Malaysia are really the top two palm oil producers globally, accounting for about 85% of global supply. The biggest palm oil importers are India, China, and the third would be the European Union. And the other commodity that has a very strong connection to Southeast Asia is rubber. Here we have not only Malaysia and Indonesia producing, but also Thailand, Cambodia, Vietnam in the rubber sector, and 90% of natural rubber actually comes from this region. So the implications are, of course, clear. That's why we have also this seminar. We're very fortunate to have speakers that work on the ground here in Southeast Asia. Next slide, please. So to frame our discussion, because there is a lot to unpack, but we focus on broadly two debates or questions, which is the practical feasibility, all these challenges that come with the due diligence requirement for the operators and the traders, the companies that are involved, the smallholders, and so on. And then the policy debate is also a component of our discussion now, because what other measures could the EU have taken, or can governments take in general, to address deforestation? Because in the broader scheme of things, a unilateral trade measure such as the EUDR is not necessarily the only or the right policy approach. So with this, I'm very pleased now to kick off the panel discussion. And we have 4 speakers, which I will introduce briefly as we proceed. As the first speaker, we have Dr. Surina Ismail. She is the Chief Sustainability Officer of the IOI Corporation based in Malaysia. So IOI is one of the biggest palm oil producer based in Malaysia. We're very pleased to have her with us today, because she represents here the corporate perspective. So Surina, good evening. My first or my set of questions to you relate to the corporate perspective and how the EUDR was perceived when it was adopted in June 2023. And then from a big corporation, what opportunities do you see? What concerns do you see with this piece of legislation? And then, of course, sharing with us insights from IOI in concrete steps that your company is taking in order to comply. And last but not least, do these concrete steps also imply supporting measures to smallholders on the ground in Malaysia or in other countries? So without further ado, Surina, I pass it over to you. Many thanks again.
Thank you, Stefanie. Thank you, IISD and SMU, for having me to share our perspective from a sustainable palm oil player. Well, from the perspective of a corporate, from an organization like ours, EUDR was always perceived as, opportunity. But unfortunately, so far, what we have seen is a lot of challenges. The reason being is that the challenges comes from the fact that the EUDR was implemented in a rather haphazard manner. There was no real engagement with the producer country. There was, uncertainties in some of the guidelines. I think case in point is the risk categories for the countries that are, exporting to EU. So every time there is a regulation that has a lot of uncertainties, it's very bad. It's very difficult for businesses to comply. There was a lot of what ifs and what should we do? So this was the concern. This was a major concern that we have as a corporation. And I don't think this is just on the basis of the big companies, but definitely for the smaller, medium enterprises, and especially definitely for the smallholders. In terms of the opportunities, we have always been in the forefront of sustainability. For example, we committed to no deforestation, no planting on peat, and no social exploitation at NDPE since 2015. And we have actually, within our corporation, have a moratorium on deforestation. So in other words, even as far back as 2016, we have already made sure that there are no new opening of any land that are virgin forests, for example. So for us, as a corporation, the EUDR was not so much of an issue to comply. We met all the requirements. Obviously, as a corporation, we also utilize supply chains. And our suppliers are the ones that we are quite concerned with. We have, of course, bigger suppliers and smaller suppliers. Now, in Malaysia, the difference being is that we have also both Malaysian Sustainable Palm Oil Certification. And the country has introduced sort of what they call MSPO trace to allow us to a certain extent, trace our suppliers. So in terms of supply chain perspective, traceability is there. However, the requirement of wanting the geolocation and the maps, that is also another difficulty, because it's not a very simple manner to just map your suppliers. So these are some of the things that we look at in terms of concerns. And the opportunity that we have is this: we are fully integrated. We are both a plantation as well as a resource-based manufacturing business. What a lot of people are not aware of is that the EUDR is not just about deforestation, but it goes down the supply, the chains of up to manufacturing. So there is a component in the EUDR called the Annex 1, where it lists specifically what are the products that will be subject to the EUDR. And if you were to look into the Annex 1, you will see that specifically under a palm oil, the annex have 14 what we call HS codes, referring to the products downstream. The products are downstream you're talking about are chemical products. Therefore, the complexity of trying to identify traceability at that level is, I would say, very, 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 very difficult, almost to the point of impossible, because there's a lot of components associated downstream. And this is only specific to the palm oil, not to the other commodities. That in itself is another thing that we have looked at it and seen that there is not a clear level playing field for all commodities when it comes to the EUDR. In terms of opportunities, because we are vertically integrated, we could meet the requirement, but at very high expense. The problem is, would our downstream customers purchase that to meet the requirement? And because of the complexity, the requirements associated with it, the amount that we can produce are also very limited. So not a lot of the companies are vertically integrated like us who are able to produce the palm oil down to the manufacturing base part. So this is another aspects I think not many people are aware of. So
Surina, thank you very much. If I can jump on one of the points, in a way you say that you can comply, but then you mentioned the challenges of geolocalization and the maps. What are the concrete steps that the company is currently undertaking to either get these maps or find ways to, to have easier access from your experience? Yeah, thank you.
So IOI is our basis of operation is mainly in Malaysia. And so in Malaysia, as I mentioned, we have the Malaysian Sustainable Palm Oil Certification. So what we have been doing is we've been engaging a lot with the Malaysian Sustainable Palm Oil Agency to make sure that now that we have the traceability to our suppliers, can we get also the maps? So that maps, which is the polygons of our suppliers, to a certain extent, it is ongoing. It's in progress. It's not yet complete. To be honest, in MSPO certification for all oil palm players in Malaysia is up to about close to 90%. So 90% of all players, from the smallholders to the bigger players to the mills, are MSPO certified. So that allows that sustainability component and the traceability component to be in. However, it is not a requirement for MSPO to have the maps. And that's the component that we are working together very closely, not just us, but the Malaysian Palm Oil Association are doing, working together with the Malaysian Sustainable Palm Oil Agency to try and get as many maps as possible. And also to a certain extent, even prioritizing those who are exporting to Europe to see whether or not that can be mapped. But again, as I mentioned, the export of oil, the palm oil itself, it's not the problem. The problem is as you go downstream to the specialty fats, to the fatty acids, to the fatty alcohol, to the methyl esters. These are the ones that are, I think, going to be more complex and difficult to meet. And it's going to cost a lot of money, and not just on the basis, or not just in Malaysia, but in Europe itself. So we have actually mentioned this to the EU, that a lot of the manufacturing facilities in EU will not be able to meet that kind of stringent requirement of the Annex 1.
Yes, thank you very much, Surina. As a first question to you, I would like to move on to our second speaker, who is Mrs. Rukaiyah Rafik. She is the head of secretariat of the Yayasan FORTASBI Indonesia, an organization that represents smallholders. So we're very pleased also to have you, Rukaiyah, with us as a representative of the smallholders. I would like to draw the attention to the audience that if interpretation is required, you can click on the bottom for English translation that is available. Okay, so Rukaiyah, for you, we have the question on smallholders and farmers in Southeast Asia, and especially if they are, in your experience, aware of these requirements, because a lot is also, of course, communication. If there is awareness of this new regulation, and if so, how also it was perceived. Then we heard from Surina already, there are barriers, there are difficulties. In your opinion, what are the biggest barriers for smallholders in particular? Again, meeting these due diligence requirements. And last but not least, what support would be needed to smallholders in particular? Thank you very much again, Rukaiyah. You have the floor.
Oke. Terima kasih Stefanie. Selamat malam teman-teman semua. Saya akan menggunakan bahasa Indonesia untuk memastikan bahwa saya menjawab dengan baik dan komprehensif. Tadi Ibu Surina sudah menjelaskan ada tantangan-tantangan sebetulnya yang dihadapi oleh perusahaan juga, dan sebenarnya kalau kita tarik ke bawah, karena petani
If you
swadaya
look
ini
at
adalah
the smallholder,
petani yang memang
independent
mendapatkan
smallholder,
implikasi yang cukup besar
they
terkait
also
dengan
affected
UDR.
by the
Pertanyaannya apakah
UDR.
petani
So if your question
memahami
is,
atau kemudian
do
menyadari
they
bahwa
aware
regulasi
about
mengenai
this
UDR?
new
Kalau kita
regulation?
tanya mereka,
Well, if you ask
Indonesia
them,
sendiri itu memiliki
in
sekitar
Indonesia,
2,7
we
juta
have
petani swadaya.
2.7
Saya bicara
million
mengenai petani
independent
swadaya karena
smallholder.
yang
I'm
paling
talking about independent
di
smallholder
antara petani
in this
yang
case
lain
because
itu
they
adalah
are
petani swadaya.
the
Kalau
weakest
di Indonesia itu sekarang
in
memiliki
position.
dua kategori petani yang
In
utama
Indonesia,
adalah
we have two
petani yang
different
terbuka
category of
dan publik.
smallholders. The
Yang
first
kedua
is the
adalah petani
scheme
swadaya
smallholders,
yang
and
tidak
they have
memiliki
a
kebun
partner with
apapun dari
the
dan
company, and the
bertahan
second
secara
is the independent
independen. Jadi
smallholder.
dalam konteks ini saya kan
So in this context,
berbicara
I'm only
konteks
talking
petani
about
swadaya.
the
Nah, kalau
independent
kita lihat
smallholder.
bahwa
So if
2,7
you look
petani
at
swadaya di
the
Indonesia,
number 2.7 million independent
apakah mereka
smallholder,
memahami dan
do
mengenal
they
mengenai
aware
UDR? Mayoritas mungkin
on
saya
this
bilang bahwa
UDR?
hanya
I can say that
10%
only
yang tahu bahwa
10% of
ada.
them aware
Lalu
about
bagaimana
this
dengan
regulation.
90%?
So
Karena kalau
how
kita
about the rest,
kalkulasikan juga
90%?
sekarang ini
If you
dengan
look at the current situation,
standar yang ada yang sudah berlaku sejak 10 tahun yang lalu,
with the
misalnya
existing standard that
standar
already
ISO, standar ISPO.
applied
Karena
since 10 years
kalau di
ago,
Malaysia
such as RSPO and
standar
ISPO.
Tapi
In
kalau di
Malaysia,
Indonesia
they
kita
have
punya
MSBO.
ISPO,
In Indonesia, we have
Indonesia Sustainable Palm
Indonesian
Oil.
Sustainable
Kalau
Palm
kita lihat
Oil.
komparasikan juga
So if you compare it
standar nasional
with
itu
the national
hanya
standard,
0,3% yang
only
comply
0.3% comply. So
Artinya,
only 0.3% independent
itu
smallholder
menjadi
comply to
tantangan besar
ISPO.
bagaimana
So this
memastikan
is a
bahwa
big
regulasi yang
challenge
baru
to
ketika
make
kita
sure that
perkenalkan,
this new
itu juga
regulation,
akan
when
mendapatkan
it is
hambatan yang cukup
applied,
besar mengenai
I'm sure that there's
informasi
going
dan
to be
pengetahuan
a
petani swadaya.
huge
Jadi kalau kita
challenge
bilang bahwa
for them.
UDR tidak terlalu dikenal.
So UDR, I can
Secara
say
ini,
that they
karena
don't
UDR ini mungkin baru
aware
dan
about that.
diskusi-diskusi yang mengenai UDR itu
This
baru
is a new regulation,
berada di level
and discussions on
tingkat
UDR
atas. Jadi
is only at the
pemerintah.
higher level,
Tetapi
at the
petani-petani
government
yang di
level.
desa itu tidak
But on the
memahami
ground, the
ya,
smallholders,
seperti itu.
they
Terus
are
yang
not
kedua
aware about this.
adalah terkait dengan
And then second,
apa namanya
regarding
mengenai
the
apakah ada hambatan apa gitu. Hambatan apa sih yang
challenges
sebetulnya dihadapi oleh petani? Yang pertama tuh mereka nggak
faced
punya
by
akses
the
informasi.
smallholders.
Mereka nggak paham
Okay,
tentang
first challenge, they don't
UDR.
have
Mereka
access
nggak
to
tahu
information.
UDR
They
itu
don't
apa,
know
regulasi
anything
apa.
about the
Apakah
UDR,
sama dengan
about this
resiko,
new
apakah sama dengan
regulation.
resiko.
Is it the same with
Gitu. Karena di
RSPO? Is
dalam
it the
diskusi
same with
kita sekalipun
ISPO?
mereka bilang bahwa
Because when
ini
we have
seperti
this
berbeda ya,
discussion
karena
with the farmers,
menurut mereka
the smallholders,
UDR itu tidak sama dengan sertifikasi.
they think that UDR is
Jadi
different.
mereka kemudian banyak bertanya, lalu UDR itu seperti
So
apa?
they
Jadi
ask,
ini yang menjadi
so what
diskusi
is
ketika kami juga
this
sebetulnya yang
UDR?
bekerja untuk
So
mempromosikan sustainability
we
di bidang
try
petani.
to
Ketika kami
raise
bicara
awareness.
dengan petani swadaya yang sudah
We have discussion with the smallholders.
ketika kami
They
mereka
have
bilang ini apa
certified
lagi
in
gitu.
RSPO and
Bukan standar
ISPO,
ISPO dan
but
RSPO
now
saja belum
coming
bisa
new
diimplementasikan
regulations.
semua, kok tiba-tiba ada
The
regulasi
national
yang lain.
standard is not yet
Dan
implemented,
memang ini
and
yang
now there's
perlu
new
ya
regulation
menjadi
coming.
diskusi kita
So
bahwa
yeah, this is something that we need
informasi
to
yang lemah di tingkat petani.
keep
Yang kedua adalah mengenai
sounding,
kalau kita
because
bicara
they
mengenai
do have
UDR,
limited
ada
access to
persyaratan
information.
legalitas.
And
Dan
then if you
juga
talk about
juga
UDR,
mengenai
there's
traceability.
requirements on
Problem utama
legality
pada
and
petani swadaya
traceability.
adalah mayoritas petani, saya bicara
The
mengenai
biggest
Indonesia,
problem
mayoritas petani di Indonesia itu
in Indonesia, the
belum
smallholder,
memiliki
they do not
sertifikat
yet
legalitas.
have
Meskipun
a
mereka berada
land
di area
legality
yang
certificate,
diperbolehkan untuk kelapa sawit,
even though
tapi
they are
mereka
farmed
belum tentu memiliki
in an area that is allowed for agriculture
pengelolaan
activities, but they do not have
satu.
the
Jadi
land
itu
title yet.
hambatan juga yang terbesar. Yang kedua,
So that is
mayoritas
one of
petani
the biggest
swadaya di
challenge.
Indonesia,
And then
saya
secondly,
tidak bicara mengenai yang
the majority of smallholder in Indonesia, I'm not talking about the certified smallholder that are already certified in the RSPO because they are already aware about traceability. But the other smallholders, they cannot provide information on geolocation. They do not have the knowledge to do mapping of their land. And then the other challenge is access to support. Independent smallholder, if they get support from other parties, they can comply to this regulation, but they need that support. Moreover, if you look at the RSPO and IISPO certification process, when they get help, they can comply to that requirements. And the RSPO certified smallholders, they cannot obtain that certification without support from the company and NGO. It means that if we want smallholder to comply with EUDR, we need to get the support. So we need to help them. And we need to understand the situation on the ground. In Indonesia, I don't know if you have the same issue in Malaysia, but in Indonesia, between the smallholder and the mills, there is an intermediary, and this intermediary is not permanent. So smallholders, when they sell their FFB to the mills, they sell it through intermediaries. So they are not directly selling the FFB to mills, but through the intermediaries. And these intermediaries is not permanent. Why they sell through intermediaries? This is because the service and the price. So we need to also consider this non-permanent structure, these intermediaries, how we can engage them to reach out to the smallholders. So those are the challenges internally and externally. That is all. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much, Rukaiyah. It's very interesting to listen. We hear that you mention the supportive role of NGOs and the companies, and I wonder if there would have also been a part of the responsibility actually coming from the European Union imposing these kind of requirements in better checking what is going on the ground and the specific information that or situation that is happening in Indonesia. So I'm sure we will have further discussion in the Q&A session on these points in this case. So our third speaker is Nicolas Lockhart. He's a partner at Sidley Austin based in Geneva. And Sidley Austin is really is probably the law firm with the expertise in international trade law. So very fortunate also to have you join Nicolas. And you're not from the palm oil sector per se, but you are very familiar with the EUDR. And the question that we have for you is, from these key legal requirements that are in the EUDR, what are the most urgent practical obstacles for companies? And what are some really short-term solutions that can be implemented, and the longer-term solutions that would help big companies, small companies to comply with these new legal requirements. So thank you, Nicolas, for being with us today.
Thanks so much for the invitation. It's also a real privilege to speak after the two previous speakers. It was really great to hear insights both from a large company and from smallholder perspective. So as Stefanie just mentioned, I'm a practitioner. And just to be transparent, I'd like to acknowledge that we represent clients with respect to the EUDR. Our clients tend to be large companies, trade associations. We're helping them with compliance with EUDR. And we've also had conversations around WTO issues on EUDR. So I always like to be transparent about those things. But so to your questions, Stefanie, about what are the practical challenges, I think the two previous speakers have both outlined really eloquently some of the challenges, and I'm going to echo what they've already said. One thing I would like to do before going into what the challenges are is to make an overarching point, which I think also reflects the perspective of the two previous speakers, which is I don't think you ever hear anybody, my clients, companies, say they do not agree with the objectives of EUDR. I think there is universal agreement with the objectives of the EUDR. That is not where the problem lies. The problem is, how do you best achieve the objectives of the EUDR? And you can ask that question at a number of levels, and I will, but one of the questions is a unilateral environmental measure taken by the EU the best way to achieve that objective? My personal view is no, and I'll come back to that. But in terms of practical challenges, I think what we are currently seeing with EUDR and with a number of other measures in the EU Green Deal is that the EU has adopted a lot of regulation with terrific objectives, but without, I think, fully appreciating some of the challenges that those regulations would create. And we saw last year EUDR was postponed by 1 year. We've heard today of practical challenges. In the chat, we've also been talking about the EU Omnibus, which is looking to simplify other key pillars of the Green Deal, the Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive, Due Diligence Directive, Taxonomy Regulation, CBAM. And all of this, I think, is symptomatic of a broader problem, which is that the EU has pushed really far, really fast, but I think without a really thorough understanding of what the consequences would be of the legislation that they have put in place. And now I'll go from there to echo some of the points that have already been made. I think fundamentally the biggest challenge that EUDR poses is the traceability requirements. And both speakers have spoken eloquently about that. Now, why is traceability such a problem? The short answer is because supply chains are incredibly complex. And let me give you just a couple of examples, and I will talk maybe more broadly geographically, if that's okay. But I think that's interesting to hear as well. The problems are not limited to Southeast Asia. So coffee. So traceability goes back to the plant where the coffee was grown. But in the supply chain of coffee, coffee gets aggregated, and it gets aggregated into containers. And a recent survey, which was conducted by Brazilian exporters, established that in a single container of Brazilian coffee beans, there is production from more than 150 producers. And in Brazil, there are 57,000 containers exported every year. So that just gives you, if you just multiply those numbers, that gives you a flavor for the complexity for coffee beans. In Africa, it is apparently something like 450 producers per container. Those beans then get aggregated again with other containers, and they get ground into coffee products. And so at each point in the supply chain, the complexities mount. For cattle, cattle has to be traced back to the place where each individual cow in a herd was born. In Brazil, there are 230 million head of cattle. Currently, 1% of places of birth are subject to registration. The United States is one of the top exporters of wood pulp to the EU, which is used in products like diapers. It's the fiber in diapers. The problems are not limited to developing countries. They're also limited to developed countries like the United States. So the United States, they also have most of 50 to 60% of US production is smallholders. 11 million smallholders produce this wood pulp. Now, the fiber flow process for production of the wood pulp involves typically more than 10,000 different plots of land. And that wood pulp is coming from the very beginning of the supply chain, where people pick up material from the ground next to the logs, all the way through wood chips, and at every stage in the supply chain. So there are multiple points where wood chips are blended throughout the supply chain to produce what is then exported to the EU and subject. So the complexities are there in every supply chain that makes traceability in some cases impossible to achieve. The burden of this falls most particularly on smallholders, and we've already heard of the numbers of smallholders in Indonesia, but it's the same in every other developing country for all of these commodities. It's even the same, as I said, in the US for wood. Ethiopia, for example, 5 million smallholders producing coffee. What is happening already in the market, I think, tells a very interesting story. So for coffee, data from late 2024 shows that there's already a big increase in market share for Brazilian coffee producers. Simultaneously, there's been a sharp drop in market share for East African coffee producers. And the reason is perceived risks around EUDR. The Brazilians are not benefiting because people are drinking more coffee. That is coming at the expense of probably smallholders in a developing country in East Africa. And that surely is not what we are trying to achieve with a measure like the EUDR. Let me also highlight some of the other challenges which maybe haven't received so much attention. So in order to comply, you need to create data systems at a national level, which in most cases just don't exist. Those data systems then need to be interoperable with the EU's data systems to enable transfer of the data. There are significant concerns around privacy, and those are across countries. Sharing information with a foreign government on geolocation, contracts, suppliers, all of this data has to go to the EU. And I know from speaking with large suppliers that this raises concerns with smallholders, with private businesses. What's happening to my data? Why does this need to be shared with the European Union? There are endless problems with definitions, with uncertainties in the laws. How to define things like planted forests, plantation forests, natural forests, primary forests. And going back to unilateralism, there are different understandings of these concepts in different legal systems. And that is another adjustment that has to be made and another set of understanding. There's no common set of maps for forests. That has to be aligned as well. So let me move, Stefanie, if I may, from practical challenges to legal challenges, because I think that's a really important part of this conversation. Now, these are measures that pursue a climate objective, and they do so through trade restrictions, through trade measures. From an international law perspective, these are measures that are legal hybrids. They have a foot in two different legal worlds. They are climate measures and trade measures. That means that they have to comply with the rules that apply to both climate measures and trade measures. And there's some really interesting principles that the EU and the rest of the international community have agreed when it comes to how to tackle climate change. And those principles are critical if we want to achieve the objective of this regulation, and if we want to do so in a manner that ensures sustainable development, and in particular for smallholders. And the principles that I'd like to mention are, first of all, international cooperation. Cristina said it in her introductory remarks. You cannot solve deforestation or climate change through a unilateral measure. You can only do it through cooperation. Cristina also made another extremely interesting observation. At COP26, the international community came together to call for a halt to deforestation by 2030. In the EUDR, notwithstanding its position in the international community, has adopted a different date for cutoff for deforestation for market access to the EU, and that is 2020. There's a fundamental tension between what the EU is doing unilaterally and what it has agreed to internationally. The second principle I want to mention is the principle of common but differentiated responsibilities. And that is a principle in international environmental law. It's a foundation of the international climate change regime. And the essence of that principle is to secure a just and inclusive transition. The EU has been at pains to ensure a just and inclusive transition internally within the EU. CBDR seeks to achieve that internationally for the smallholders, for developing countries. That principle should be respected when it comes to measures like EUDR, and it is not being respected. And so it seems to me that in a conversation about challenges, it's important for us to recall what the EU has agreed internationally and to think best about how we can achieve these important objectives through cooperation and through respecting principles like common but differentiated responsibilities.
Yes. Thank you. Thank you so much, Nicolas. I think your point is an excellent segue to our last speaker, which is Florencia. I will give her the floor immediately. I just want to point out the complexities that you have mentioned regarding supply chain, as well as the complexity of international relations and cooperation. And that brings me exactly to the last speaker, who is Florencia Sarmiento, a policy advisor at IISD, and with whom I had the pleasure to co-organize today's webinar. She will speak about a different set of instruments or tools that have been used earlier than the EUDR. So I'm talking about voluntary sustainability standards. So Florencia, for you, the question is, based on the extensive research that IISD has done in the past, is there any evidence that these voluntary standards that also have the objectives of fighting deforestation globally are indeed effective? Are they reducing deforestation? Are they promoting sustainability? And then, of course, how do these standards now interact with the EUDR?
Thank you. Thank you very much, Stefanie. Before going straight to the question and answer whether voluntary sustainability standards are effective, I thought that perhaps having in mind the audience that we have today, I'll take a step back and just start by introducing what are VSS? What do we mean by VSS? Now, voluntary sustainability standards, VSS, are largely market-based tools that set social, economic, and environmental requirements to make production more sustainable. And these standards, this requirement can cover human rights, environmental protection, and other sustainability criteria. And compliance with these standards allows products to obtain formal market recognition. For instance, when we go to a supermarket, you may notice organic, fair trade, Rainforest Alliance certified products. And this market recognition and distinction can help consumers and buyers choose more sustainable products. And over time, and for many years, private sector actors in commodity sectors that are particularly or typically associated with deforestation, such as palm oil or soybean, have widely adopted VSS as a mechanism to advance deforestation-free supply chains. But now, what is the role that they have in enhancing forest conservation and reducing deforestation? Based on our research and examining several major VSS operated or covering deforestation risk commodities, we see that there are two key considerations that we must take into account. The first one is the criteria coverage, and the second one is the outcomes that they can have on the ground. In terms of the criteria coverage, most VSS include a ban on converting high biodiversity, high carbon stock, or conservation value areas, and some include also cutoff dates, such as 2005 or 2008, for example. Many of these VSS require producers to restore natural areas, and some explicitly incorporate reforestation criteria. Others have, for example, requirements of forest management plans and reforestation efforts. So this is in terms of of the criteria. But then in terms of the outcomes or the impact that they can have on the ground, our research, along with other studies, indicate that voluntary sustainability standards can have and have positive impacts addressing deforestation, and in particularly at the farm and plantation levels. But they work better in certain contexts, in certain commodities, and the results also vary by location. But what is the interaction then if we're thinking of deforestation, EUDR, and these standards? It is generally understood nowadays, thinking about the implementation of EUDR, that the standards can indeed support companies and producers in meeting EUDR's due diligence requirements. Preliminary research shows that VSS can help with risk assessment, with product traceability, and also with stakeholder accountability. And indeed, the regulation itself, EUDR itself in Article 10, explicitly acknowledges that certification schemes, voluntary sustainability standard, can assist in risk assessment, but they made a special caveat, that is that operators still remain responsible for full due diligence compliance, even when they're using VSS. It's not a green line, they still need to conduct full due diligence. But then interestingly, because I mentioned how the impacts vary and the criteria also vary, the EU is publishing guidance about the regulation and certain clarifications, Q&A. And in this guidance, the EU specifically recommends and sets certain criteria that companies can use to assess which standards are they going to use to support compliance. And these criteria are three. The first one is to assess the applicable standards, that is, what requirements do these standards cover? And this may mean to assess whether they align with the deforestation-free definition. What is the cutoff date? You mentioned in your presentation that the cutoff date is 2020, but other standards have other dates, so you need to assess that. Then the second criteria is, how are these requirements implemented? What is the implementation of these requirements? And this includes whether there's transparency in the scheme, whether there's stakeholder engagement, what are the reports, what are the audits, what are the compliance checks. And then lastly, the third criteria that the EU recommends to use is assessing governance, credibility, and the oversight. And this can be, what are the measures that are taken in case of no compliance? What is the independence of the third-party auditors that will grant the certificate and decide that the product may get that recognition in the market? And one last interesting thing to note about this is that with this evolving context of sustainability regulations, the standards itself have started to adapt their own frameworks to align with EUDR requirements. So for example, VSS are enhancing their risk assessment and traceability. You have Rainforest Alliance that uses combination of satellite mapping technology with field-based and third-party audits to assess the risks of deforestation. The Forest Stewardship Council also has a portal that tracks forest borders, indigenous lands, conservation areas. You have RSPO that uses satellite data for real-time monitoring and potential fires in palm oil plantations. So one could argue that the main advantage of VSS are its traceability systems that can help importers verify the sustainable sources. So just to conclude this, my intervention, I wanted to highlight that VSS, while VSS certainly cannot replace public regulation, they cannot replace the regulatory due diligence, they really offer a valuable support mechanisms for the risk assessment, for the traceability, and for compliance, specifically for smallholder farmers. And as EUDR is implementing, VSS are evolving to provide more support, more robust compliance tools to really include the geolocation and the tracking and improve chain of custody requirements. And we need collaboration. So leveraging VSS effectively can enhance the sustainability efforts, can ease regulatory compliance for smallholders, and can contribute to broader goals of sustainability, including deforestation. Thank you.
Thank you so much for adding this perspective as well, where we see potentially the good thing about EUDR is to also impact on or maybe improve some of these voluntary standards. And we have, of course, also heard about the Indonesian and the Malaysian voluntary standard MSPO and ISPO. So that closes our first round, nicely the discussion. I would like to briefly ask our colleague again if we can see the results of the poll that, I apologize, was not being shown earlier, but maybe now we have the word cloud. So again, the question was, what kind of support do you think is needed to ensure compliance with the EUDR, right? And so in the middle, you see those that have been voted the most is capacity building and financial support. Also see the buzzword that was mentioned by Cristina and Nicolas, cooperation. And this, of course, cooperation can imply interstate cooperation and also cooperation, public-private, better engaging with those that are working on the ground. And yeah, other than that, similar, we have technological support, very important for the traceability, technical assistance. So they all pinpoint to the same question of this complexity related to the traceability requirements in this particular piece of legislation. So thank you very much for your submissions. And I would like to end this first round, as I said, of panel discussion to move on to the Q&A question session, which is, of course, a further possibility for our audience to engage with the speakers. I, from my part, thank again to this excellent contributions from all our speakers. I'm also apologizing. I think we're not doing justice to your expertise, but that's often the difficulty in these kind of panel discussions. So without further ado, I hand back to Cristina Larrea from IISD to guide us through the Q&A session. Many thanks from my side. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Stefanie. A great discussion with the experts. And thank you so much. I think there is a lot of wisdom in this room. We heard many good insights. And of course, the road is not easy, but we will walk one step at a time. And I'm sure that with the collective knowledge of each of the experts and all the actors involved in commodity production, hopefully we will leverage this opportunity to protect forests. We have a lot of questions from the audience, and the audience has been very engaging. So I would start with one question to Mrs. Rookie. Okay, because you mentioned that very small percentage of farmers know about the EUDR in Indonesia. So we have a question to you that says, how do you suggest to explain or to ensure the buy-in or to convince, that was the right word in the question, and a smallholder farmer to take on practice EUDR in their farming practices? How would you think could be the best approach to help them understand and to get the buy-in?
Oke, terima kasih. Jadi mungkin kalau
Thank you
kita
for these
mau
questions.
tadi secara
So
sukarela untuk masuk
if
dalam
you
ini,
want the
maka yang paling
smallholders to
bisa kita dorong
voluntarily
adalah manfaat dan
join this scheme,
manfaat atau
we need
penelitian.
to
Karena
show
tadi yang saya
them
sampaikan
the
bahwa
benefit and incentive of
standar itu kan
joining this
menjadi salah satu
scheme, because
tantangan
standard
bagi petani dan itu akan berbiaya.
is a challenge
Mereka
for
akan
the
mengeluarkan
smallholders,
biaya untuk
and
melakukan
it is
pemetasan.
quite
Mereka
costly.
akan
They
mengeluarkan
have
biaya
to
untuk
do the
mendapatkan
mapping, they
mereka
have
akan
to
mengeluarkan
obtain the
biaya
land
untuk
legality,
sampai
and
ke
it take
baik perkebunan.
it takes
Berarti
costs
mereka
for them.
mengeluarkan biaya
Means
untuk
that
comply terhadap regulasi.
there are
Kalau
expenses
hanya
that
mereka
they need to
disuruh
do to
gitu,
comply to the
tanpa
regulation.
kemudian mereka
If
dapatkan
we only ask them to
insentif
comply
dari
to the
partai
regulation
tersebut,
without
maka
showing
mereka
them
tidak
the
akan
benefit,
memiliki
I am certain that they will
keinginan untuk
not
terlibat. Jadi
have
kita ingin
the
melibatkan mereka,
willingness
tetapi harus
to
juga
buy
dipastikan
in
bahwa
this
mereka
regulation.
mendapatkan
So we
manfaat
need
dari
to
sana.
show the
Yang
benefit for
paling
them.
penting diinginkan oleh petani
What's
adalah karena kan selama ini
what the
yang
smallholder
problem
wants
petani
the
adalah
most is that
akses informasi, akses
because
pasar
the
yang baik,
biggest
akses
challenge is
harga yang
market
baik,
to the
gitu ya. Itu yang
access
menjadi
to the
concern
market,
petani. Nah,
access
kalau
to
kita
the
dia
better
bisa
price.
menjawab itu,
If
dia
UDR
bisa
can
mendorong akses
addressing that challenges,
apa namanya pasar
if
yang baik,
UDR
artinya
can
UDR bisa
bring
mendorong
good things to the
mengakses
smallholders,
pasar
for
langsung ke
example,
mill,
it can help them to access for the smallholder sell directly to the mills. Maybe they will consider to comply to the EUDR. And then if EUDR can help them to increase the FFB price, means that there's a price difference between smallholders that comply to EUDR and smallholders that does not comply. So if there's a better price for their FFB, means that that's incentive for them, so they can cover the cost for compliance. Oh, I forgot something. We only have time until 2025 December before we effectively apply the EUDR. There is something that I did not find in this regulation, which is the inclusions of independent smallholder. For human rights, there is a section on the human rights due diligence, right? And then no deforestation due diligence. But there is no independent smallholders inclusiveness due diligence. And I think that it should be included. It should be one of the indicator in this due diligence. If you can cover the inclusions of independent smallholders in the EUDR, I am certain that the companies that will support the smallholders. And if we can make sure that the oil palm product exported to the EU, there's a part of independent smallholder there, that would be great for them. But now there's no inclusions of independent smallholders. So that is something that we can encourage to make sure the inclusion of independent smallholders, because smallholders actually they have concern for the no deforestation issue, but they don't know how, and there's no one support them. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Excellent contributions on your side. Thank you so much, Mrs. Rukaiyah. Okay, we have another question for Mrs. Surina, and I would like to make the link with we just heard. I mean, do you see private sector actors providing that financial incentive of market access incentive for smallholders that comply with EUDR? I would say that that's a question. And the other question is, if you can explain a bit more or clarify what is much more harder for downstream processors and manufacturers to comply. Okay, so these two as a follow-up, because we have a clear question from Mrs. Rukaiyah on incentives. So what is the role that private sector actors can do on this?
Thank you for the question. Before we proceed, there were a couple of things that I wanted to clarify. The Malaysian Sustainable Palm Oil, as well as the ISPO, are mandatory standards. They are not voluntary standards. I think Ibu Rukaiyah would also agree with me. So it's slightly different. That means if you do not comply, you actually will get the government to stop your production and for you to even be able to sell your fruits. So just at least in Malaysia, it's very clear. So about smallholders, how do we help them? The point is, it's not so much about the financial support that they need. They need more ability to understand what is the EUDR. I mean, first and foremost, when you look at deforestation, when you look at high conservation area, when you look at high carbon stock area, these are very technical terms. I'm not downplaying the ability for them to understand, but you're looking at smallholders where they are concerned about their areas, how they want to subsist daily. So the idea of biodiversity, they don't know what biodiversity is. Even some of the players don't know what actually biodiversity, because biodiversity is not just about species. It's about soil biodiversity. It's about plant biodiversity. It's so much more complex. So the requirements of the EUDR, the difficulty is about the geolocation. So even us as companies, when we approach our direct suppliers, we have leverage. But a lot of the small holders, they go through, just like Ibu Uki was saying, go through traders, middlemen. So we don't have access to them sometimes. So it becomes very difficult for us to have direct, leverage on how to help them. And they're not just at one place. They are all over the place, at different small areas. And it's, Malaysia is smaller. Indonesia is a lot bigger and a lot more spread out. So it's not, I think people think that financial support is the way to go. No, it's more than that. You actually have to hold their hands to make them understand what is it that needs to be done. And this sort of, that this barrier that you see is this gap is where the misunderstanding that comes into play. So I think what we need are more people, more capacity building to understand. So that, to me, capacity building is what we try to do. We try to share our best management practices. We try, because, for example, one of the things that are most fundamental for smallholders is yield. And we need to help them to do that first, to get that yield. And that's where we share our knowledge. We bring our expertise down to the ground to help them out. So I think this is the practical help that big corporations, because money generally, for example, the MSPO, the government had given financial support to the independent smallholders in Malaysia to be certified under MSPO. So that's the reason why in Malaysia, for example, it's up to 90% that has been certified, and it is mandatory. Therefore, if you are not MSPO certified, you might not be able to sell your product. So that's one thing. The second one, the more difficult part. Now, if you understand, in palm oil, we produce two kinds of oil, the crude palm oil and the crude palm kernel oil. These two kinds of oil addresses different markets. Most of the time, the crude palm oil are for food, biodiesel is one of them, specialty fats, all those things that goes into your food, like your bread and everything. And then you have the technical oil, the crude palm kernel oil, that you produce from the oleochemical side. So under the EUDR, Annex 1 has very specific codes that refers to the products coming out from palm oil. And unfortunately, what happens is after you produce the palm kernel oil, you're now going to produce the chemical aspects where you find in your, for example, in your shampoos, you find, for example, alcohols that are coming from palm, from soy, from many different sources. You have acids, you have amides, amines, all this are the downstream. Now, these chemicals are subject to EUDR. And the problem is, these are very small components. So you're talking, forget 1,000, forget 2,000. It can come to tens of thousands entrants coming to form the product. So if you want to form a fatty acid that is specific for your detergent, okay, that is a component, a carbon component within the palm oil that is being extracted, chemically reacted to produce another component. So imagine how difficult it is to try and trace this. Now, this is subject. You can only do this if it's fully segregated. In other words, from the upstream to the downstream, you follow through. We have that because we are relatively large and we are vertically integrated, but it's extremely expensive. You're talking about segregating the reactive tank, the reactors, the tanks. I mean, you're talking about segregation all the way in order to meet the requirements. That's the difficulty and the cost.
The cost. Okay, thank you very much for clarifying the question. So I hear the importance of working with this link in the value chain intermediaries, right? I think this is critical. We hear this. And we also hear the importance for innovation to enable that traceability to happen in a less costly way. Those are two critical messages that we hear from this Q&A. Let's take another question to Mr. Nicolas. As you know, Mr. Nicolas, there is a new EU-Mercosur model that was agreed on December 6, 2024. How this new EU-Mercosur model can be perceived in Southeast Asian countries, which are currently negotiating free trade agreements, such as in Indonesia. Considering the challenge of a unilateral approach, which risks both trade partnerships and political alliance, could this new model serve as a blueprint by balancing due diligence requirements with tangible benefits for trade partners? I'd be very interested in your perspective on this. I think you might recall that this new EU-Mercosur model provides some opportunities for countries in Mercosur to identify, areas of deforestation, I think to recognize certifications in these countries. I mean, can you elaborate, or do you have some insights on this important question?
Thank you very much. So on the EU-Mercosur agreement and the sustainability provisions in that agreement. So I think the first point to note is the EU is really building on a long-standing policy of incorporating sustainability into its FTAs. And in general, I think that's a really positive thing. I think it's beneficial both for trade and for sustainability. We have seen examples, and this is another example, where the sustainability provisions in an FTA seek to create market access opportunities. So they create very specific, targeted, directed, if you like, incentives for exporting countries to improve sustainability practices. And I think those are really good as well, in part because they're the product of international cooperation. So an FTA is an example of international cooperation. So when you find provisions in an FTA that offer some kind of market access incentive for sustainable practices, the chances are that the exporting country sees an opportunity to meet those requirements. And the requirements themselves have been the subject of a negotiation. And so all of that, I think, is really positive in terms of helping to drive forward both sustainable development in all of its pillars: economic development, social development, and environmental protection. And it does so precisely because it is an example of cooperation. One general observation that I would have about the EU sustainability kind of policy in its FTAs is, I think it's really important for the principles that are picked up in these agreements to be broadly and holistically reflective of all of the principles of international environmental law, and not to cherry pick. Again, I recognize that it's the subject of a negotiation, but I think it's important for principles like CBDR also to be reflected in these FTAs. And I would be encouraging Southeast Asian countries in their negotiations with the EU to be pushing not only for recognition of CBDR, which is present in some of the EU's FTAs, but actually to look for concrete ways to agree on how to implement CBDR in FTAs, because one of the criticisms that's made of CBDR is that it's a principle, it's somewhat vague and intangible. How do we implement it in practice? So what better opportunity than a cooperative trade agreement to come up with constructive ideas about how to implement the principle of CBDR. I also wanted to make, I'll stop there, Cristina. I see you want me to stop, so I'll pause.
You have 1 minute. Please go ahead. 1 minute.
Well, I wanted to make an observation just about the challenges of international cooperation, and I think Stefanie herself made that observation when I finished speaking, that yes, international cooperation is difficult, but that doesn't mean that you forgo it. And international cooperation doesn't mean either cooperating on how to implement the EUDR or CBAM. It means sovereign countries sitting down together to figure out how to solve complex problems. And the FTAs and what I've just been talking about are really good examples of that. And you should not be able, and you cannot under WTO law, proceed to unilateral environmental measures without first exhausting cooperation. And if we allow cooperation to be sidestepped, we will cause an unraveling of important international frameworks like the Paris Agreement. What incentive does the EU have to provide climate finance if it can levy money unilaterally through a CBAM?
Yeah. Okay, very good. Thank you very much, Nicolas. I think you share this opportunity tone when the Southeast Asian countries negotiate free trade agreements with the EU. They have an opportunity to speak and provide concrete measures to support the implementation of these sustainability requirements. I think that's a very good thought that you give the audience too. Thank you very much. We have 3 minutes, so it has been a great contribution from each speaker. Thank you so much. And the audience very engaging. I would like to launch the Easy Retro. We have two final comments and questions that we would like to hear from the audience. So please, my colleagues, if you can start the Easy Retro. 2 questions. What are the main key takeaway, or one of the takeaways that you leave this webinar with? And secondly, which topics would you like to see covered in future webinars? Okay, at IISD, we have been at the State of Sustainability Initiatives at IISD, we have been working on deforestation for a while. Okay, our goal is to advance sustainable and inclusive value chain. So yeah, I would like to, hear from you on these 2 answers. So please go ahead and answer. And in the meantime, I will ask my colleagues to paste some of the reports that we have already produced on deforestation, forest conservation, trade policy, as well as voluntary sustainability standards. So if Rupal, if you can paste these links, that would be very helpful for the audience. Okay, perfect. Those are great takeaways. Cooperation is key, wonderful. The legal perspective on how the climate-related measures should align with CBDR, very good. We still have a long way to go when it comes to preparing agricultural sector, especially farmers, for EUDR. Okay. Most smallholder farmers are not aware of EUDR. Very good. Concerns about data across country boundaries. Absolutely. Okay. Invite the private sector. Absolutely. Here today, we had like representatives of the private sector. Well, certainly we can have more, players of the private sector. Okay, government practice initiatives for EUDR promotion. Yeah, that would be very good. Alignment of EUDR and CBAM with Paris Agreement. Update from EU discussions with various countries' governments. This is very good, exactly. Okay, there's great feedback from the audience. Collaboration between voluntary standards and national standards. Absolutely, this is a great topic, and they already collaborate. It would be good to have webinars on this. Okay, excellent. Before we wrap, I would like to say, because I see the comments here, just 1 minute. One of the papers that my colleagues just share is the IISD developed like a couple of last year, is about measures, policy measures that governments have established already that have been more successful to address deforestation, about land rights, about forest restoration initiatives, about market incentives. Anyway, and there is this paper that we launched last year, so you can check it. And with the support of the government of Sweden, we are going to launch 3 more papers. One is the EUDR for SME, unpacking the EUDR for SMEs. Another one is unpacking EUDR for smallholders. So stay tuned in a couple of weeks or a month. And another one, which is about synergies, the role of sustainability standards in advancing deforestation and private sector measures. So we're going to look at the traceability efforts that some corporate actors are doing to address deforestation. So stay tuned. In the coming months, we will launch all these reports. I would say it's 1 minute past. I think we are ready to go. I really invite you to, you will receive a link with the evaluation. Thank you so much. Wonderful presentation and participation for our experts, speakers. Thank you for joining us from Southeast Asia, from Europe, and here from North America. And thank you very much, Stefanie Schacherer, for partnering with us on this. The Singapore Management University and Center for Commercial Law has been a pleasure to collaborate with you, and have a wonderful evening. You will receive the presentation, the recording, and the evaluation, and stay connected. We will look forward to engaging with you very soon. Thank you, everybody.